Let's talk about a feminist biography about Emma Smith that proved so controversial that the LDS Church banned both authors from speaking in church settings, and yet it was also so influential that it launched a new movement of feminist scholarship within Mormon history. Linda Newell and Val Avery's biography of Emma Smith, Mormon Enigma, is one of my favorite books in Mormon history. It was initially published by Doubleday in 1984, a second edition appeared by the University of Illinois Press a decade later, and it still remains remarkably readable today, decades after its publication. In some ways, the book was quite representative of the new Mormon history movement. It disrupted traditional myths, it was based in exhaustive archival research, and it paid attention to humanistic influences as well as the broader context. But in other ways, the book carved a new path. It focused on women, and it invoked feminist ideas and frameworks to disrupt patriarchal frameworks. It also sparked immense institutional backlash. Both authors were banned from speaking in church settings for nearly a year, and church employees remained restricted from citing it in their work for several years afterward. I want to talk about this fascinating story in this video. I'll cover the negative reputation that Emma Smith had within the LDS tradition. I'll then discuss how Newell and Avery attempted to correct that narrative by writing a biography themselves. I'll analyze the book's contents and its immediate reception, including the church's decision to blacklist the authors. And finally, I'll touch on some of the lasting legacies. This video is the final video in my series on the battles of Mormon history that I've been covering over the last few weeks that talk about various episodes and fighting over the Mormon historical narratives in the 1970s and 1980s. Please go back and check the videos on the Mark Hoffman forgeries and bombings, a 1974 MHA address so controversial that the presenter had to give a public apology, Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, as well as other debates over things like B.H. Roberts' faith in the Book of Mormon. These debates shaped the modern Mormon mind as well as the modern Mormon consciousness. And please join me this Wednesday, April 1st at 7 p.m. Mountain Time to do a live discussion about this topic where I will be answering your questions about these Mormon history battles that just seem as relevant today as they were back in the 1970s and 80s. With all that said, let's get into this particular story, the background of Mormon Enigma. It would not be an overstatement to say that Emma Smith had a negative reputation within the Latter-day Saint tradition since the church moved westward all the way up to the 1970s. I might do a full video on this topic at some point, the evolving nature of Emma Smith's legacy, but it begins with Brigham Young, who publicly denounced Emma Smith in multiple settings and blamed her for a lot of the problems in Nauvoo. He blamed her for raising a fuss about polygamy, which increased the animosity culminating in Joseph Smith's death. She claimed that it was Emma who pulled Joseph Smith back after he was on the run in June of 1844, eventually to be martyred. He even accused her of once poisoning Joseph Smith, which I should emphasize we have no evidence of actually taking place. Brigham Young once said that Joseph Smith declared he would be willing to go to hell to get Emma, and that is exactly where he will have to go in order to rescue her. And those feelings became even more hardened after the formation of the RLDS tradition with Joseph Smith III as prophet and Emma Smith supporting them. Utahns referred to that church as Emma's church and saw it as a rivalry. They also denounced Emma Smith for lying about Joseph Smith's involvement in polygamy. So she was caught up in this ecclesiastical rivalry between the LDS Church and the RLDS Church, often posited as the less faithful member of Joseph Smith family who besmirched her husband's legacy by not following the saints westward and supporting their rivals' faith. Now, fortunately, in the mid-20th century, those tensions started to cool between the LDS and the RLDS Church. There was coordination on things like the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, which I covered in a previous video. The Mormon History Association and the John Whitmer Historical Association started working together with historians, which coordination that soon reached higher levels. And those faiths, especially as they diverged on key fundamental doctrines, no longer saw each other as rivals. And with the rise of New Mormon history in the 1970s, there was more of a willingness to reassess those historical myths and reputations. And yet, New Mormon history did not do much with Emma Smith in the 1970s. Often because it was men focusing on male topics, Emma remained overlooked. And there was still ecclesiastical reasons to doubt Emma, because if you triumphed Emma's story, it might place Joseph Smith in a lesser light. Though there were exceptions, the pamphlet Judge Me, Dear Reader by Erwin Workus was one of the few texts that provided a more nuanced take on Emma. But in general, the reputation was quite negative within the LDS faithful, something that Linda Newell is going to come to recognize and want to correct. Before I go much further, a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on historical topics like this one every Monday. I connect the past to the present every Wednesday, and I pull back the curtain on the historian's craft on Friday with interviewing authors and looking at new books and digging into the primary sources behind articles so that you too can become a historian. I'm near the end of this series on the Mormon history battles of the late 20th century, so I hope you've enjoyed that. And if you really want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have done this, you can become a member of this channel, where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you comment, but most importantly, you'll sleep better at night knowing that you are supporting historical scholarship. I also encourage you to subscribe to my free newsletter. You can follow me on different social media platforms where I do supplemental videos, and I strongly encourage you to join me this Wednesday, April 1st at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, where I'll be doing a live discussion. I do these live discussions every month. I love them, and it's a chance for me to respond to your questions and kind of summarize where many of these videos have been going. So the theme for this Wednesday's discussion will be the Mormon history battles. I hope to see many of you there, but let's get back to Emma. Linda King Newell and Valine Tippett Avery are two of my heroes in Mormon history. Here you see a photograph of them together while they're working on this project that I'm going to be discussing. They were both spouses of academics who taught at universities. Their husbands had met each other while they were grad students at Duke University. Jack Newell, Linda's husband, was a grad student in American history. He would eventually become a professor at the University of Utah. And Val was married to Chuck Avery, who was a grad student in forestry and would eventually be hired by Northern Arizona University. And that's how those families got to know each other. Now, in 1973, Linda Newell attended a local BYU Education Week lecture on Eliza R. Snow. But rather than just focusing on Eliza R. Snow's legacy, the lecture juxtaposed her to Emma Smith, that Eliza was the faithful one, Emma was the unfaithful one. So Emma was just used as a tool to highlight how good Eliza was, which was in line with this negative reputation of Emma that I've been discussing. And Linda was rather upset. She wanted to get a more measured perspective of Emma. So she ended up going to a bookstore, a local Deseret Book, and saying, how can I learn more about Emma Smith? And they didn't have any materials for her. They had the Judge Me, Dear Reader, they had a novel, but there wasn't any measured accounts of Emma. So because she eventually moves to Salt Lake City because her husband was hired by the University of Utah, and so she was close to the archives, there was lots of optimism around the New Mormon history movement, she decided, why don't I write it myself? So months go by, and in 1975, the Averys, Val and her husband, visit Salt Lake City for general conference. They hang out with the Newells, and they invite the Newells to go visit them down in Flagstaff for Thanksgiving. And then after eating Thanksgiving dinner together, Linda told Val about her desire to write a biography since she was close to the sources. And then Val responded, well, why don't we do it together? To which Linda said, you're on. Now, I think we should take a pause here and appreciate the sheer audacity of that decision by these two women. Emma Smith was a topic that all the great historians of New Mormon history had stayed away from. They'd steered clear. It was not something that they chose to take on. But here are these two women, neither of whom with a graduate education, neither of whom who had written more than a college term paper, decided we are going to take on that project. I love that daring audacity, and I think that's an example for many of us. They also face a problem of living in separate states, or as Linda called called it, living in the BC era, before computers, which are going to add lots of complications to writing something in common. They didn't have access to Google Docs like we do now. And so then they commenced a 9-year project to bring the three-dimensional Emma to life. So over the next near decade, they tried to find a working situation that was going to allow both of them to contribute. Linda, because she lived in Salt Lake City and was therefore close to the sources, would dig into the archives, find the relevant sources, then make photocopies to send to Val, where Val would spend most of her time reading through the secondary literature and crafting a chronology. They both arranged for babysitters as their husbands worked, so they could spend 1 or 2 days a week on their projects. Linda would talk about the butterflies she got in her stomachs as she entered the elevator to go up to the second floor of the church office building where the archives used to be. And she spoke about how grateful she was that the Mormon history community, the Arrington's Camelot, embraced her. She said she was grateful that no one really laughed at her when she chose to take on the project. They spoke to Maureen Ursenbach Beecher, one of the wonderful women involved in Arrington's Camelot, and asked if they could expect negative feedback. And she said, well, it's always possible. I think we've moved past that, but, quote, I would be prepared if I were you. Turns out to be pretty ominous words. Val and Linda would also take extended research trips, like when they both went to Independence, Missouri, and had a wonderful reception from the RLDS community, helping them go around the RLDS archives and other relevant places. And they also participated in the Mormon History Association. One of the first things they did was join the Mormon History Association, which I urge all of you to do. Please, I know I pitched them a lot of my videos. I currently have the privilege of serving as president of the Mormon History Association. It's a welcome gathering for everyone, no matter your level of expertise. And our conference this summer, in the first week of June in Vegas, is not to be missed. So if you want to hear the new Linda Newells and Val Averys, please plan on attending the conference. They were also helped by a number of other historians, like when they were nearly taken by a fraudster who tried to sell them what they claimed was Emma Smith's diaries. It turned out to be fraud. There were plenty of other frauds, as I'll get to. And eventually they even had some success with the church, where they published a short essay on Emma that was in the church's magazine, The Ensign, in 1979, which was the first positive publication on Emma Smith in a church venue in 115 years, which is quite remarkable when you think of it. As you might imagine, co-authoring a historical book is going to be difficult in any circumstances, but doing it in different states was especially egregious. They would often take turns writing particular sections, they would go on writing retreats, and they'd have to subvert their ego to allow the other one to take crucial portions, which is really hard for historians because we are often at our hearts egotists. They also ended up fundamentally disagreeing on some core issues. Val was a bit more critical of the institution and Joseph Smith, and Linda worried that Val was taking her own frustrations with the institutions on the narrative. But in the end, they both felt like they were balancing each other out. They both had busy duties during these years too, as they were taking on new obligations. Val Avery entered the graduate program in history at Northern Arizona, where her husband was a professor. She received her master's degree in 1981 and eventually finished her PhD in 1984, the year book came out. And she would then serve as a professor at Northern Arizona for several decades, training a new generation of scholars in her skill set. Linda became co-editor with her husband Jack of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. And her family, thankfully, was a bit more accommodating than Val's in recognizing her new role. Because I think it's important to note, as they were working on Emma Smith's story, they wanted to integrate those feminist ideas into their own life, which caused some friction. There was also growing tensions with the church during this time. While Linda had a mostly supportive LDS context, Val was quite opposite. Her bishop denounced her work on Emma Smith, at one point barring her from talking about Emma Smith in a gospel doctrine class by saying, as long as he were bishop, quote, you will not talk about that woman in my church. And the problems didn't even end there. Her stake president eventually called her husband in. Note that, yes, he didn't call her in. He called her husband in and told Chuck that, quote, she had no right delving into church history, that the church has its own historians and they'll deal with it. Val shouldn't be getting involved. And he told Chuck, you need to get control of your wife. Something that Chuck apparently took seriously, which, as you might imagine, caused some friction within their marriage. And yes, there were problems with the Hoffman forgeries, most notably the Joseph Smith III blessing, which was largely accepted by historians as real at the time, something that I covered in my previous video on the Mark Hoffman forgeries and bombings. They also discovered that Hoffman was producing what was the William McClellan papers, something I discussed in the video, and they worried that if he sold it to the church would make it inaccessible to researchers, so they encouraged him instead to sell it to the University of Utah or Sam Weller Books or someone else, to which Mark Hoffman gave up the game by saying, quote, "Linda, I'm not in this for the historians. I'm in it for the money." Luckily, their reliance on the Hoffman forgeries was not enough to distort their overall narrative. As with most of Hoffman's forgeries, one of the reasons why historians took them seriously is it filled a gap of what historians expected actually took place, like the Joseph Smith III blessing. The overall process of writing their Emma Smith biography took 9 years. They submitted a 1,000-page manuscript to Doubleday, the trade press that took a chance on their project. And the press then told them they needed to cut it by a third. The worst thing for any historian to hear, and something that I myself can sympathize with, is I had to do something similar with my American Zion. And much of what they ended up having to cut away and slashing out a third of every chapter was some of the material that probably gave Joseph Smith a bit more of a softer edge, which meant the final product was a bit more critical, which is going to play a role in the reception. The book finally appeared as Mormon Enigma on October 4th, 1984. Here you see the cover from that first edition from Doubleday. So let me talk a little bit about the contents of the book before I discuss the reception. The book paid, as you might imagine, special attention to Emma's experience, the stories that are often forgotten. They trace the tenuous and unsettled nature of the Smith family during Joseph Smith's prophetic career, the lived consequences of Mormonism's constant movement. They also highlighted the gender dynamics that are often forgotten or at least invisible in our patriarchal frameworks, that Emma served, yes, as a leader, as the elect lady, but she also had severe restrictions placed on her. So you can see the structural systems of patriarchy that governed religious practice and religious life for women, even the wife of the prophet. They also spent quite a bit of time on the ugly side of polygamy, really delving into the impact of Joseph Smith's public lies from practicing polygamy, and how Emma had to suffer hearing bits and pieces and reckoning them with the public record. One of the most famous stories of Emma Smith and Nauvoo, whether she allegedly threw Eliza R. Snow down the stairs after a tumult, was quite emblematic of their process because they came to different conclusions. In fact, they had co-authored an article on whether Emma threw Eliza down the stairs that was published by BYU Studies, along with Maureen Ursenbach Beecher, the wonderful historian of Mormon women, and all three of them came to different conclusions. They presented on it at a conference of the Mormon History Association, another plug to go attend the MHA conference. And when asked by someone in the audience, "Do you think the event really took place?" all three of them answered at the same time, but gave different answers. Maureen Beecher said no, Val Avery said yes, and Linda Newell says, "I don't know." Linda wrote in a reminiscence of this story, which I'll talk about later on, that, quote, "I don't know if Emma threw Eliza down the stairs, but, quote, had it been me, I would have pushed her down the stairs," which shows that, yes, they felt the pain of polygamy. One of the most poignant stories of their working on the project came when Linda received a phone call from Val, who said, "I'm sick to my stomach. I've been lying on the floor so I won't throw up." Linda asked, "Well, why? What happened?" To which he responded, "I'm just working on the polygamy section of Nauvoo, where Joseph has taken Helen Mar Kimball as a wife." Linda, she was only 14. That's how old Maureen is, and Maureen was her only daughter. So naturally, with that background and asking these questions, Joseph takes on a different perspective in this narrative. They also, and I think this is important to remember, they also trace Emma's life after Joseph Smith's death, notably arguing that her decision to stay in Nauvoo was a logical one, not a selfish one, not one that fits into the LDS narratives of Emma staying behind for bad reasons because she was unfaithful, but because it made sense for her and her family. They also trace Emma's continued difficulties with children and her new husband, Louis Bideman, and how her life did not end when Brigham Young and the Saints went westward. Nor was she a pawn of her son, Joseph Smith III, but she lived her own life and had her own opinions. The book is a compelling read because it's beautifully written and attuned to these personal dimensions. That's why it's one of the few books on Mormon history that appeared with a big trade press. And it's why it's one of those rare books that you can still continue to read and people continue to buy decades after its release. The reception of the book at its time, as you might imagine, was a bit mixed. From the scholarly community, there was lots of praise. It received the Best Book Awards from the Mormon History Association, the John Whitmer Historical Association, as well as the prestigious Evans Biography Prize. It received lots of national attention, positive reviews in major periodicals, and it sold out of the book's first run of 10,000 copies within a month, prompting a second run of 10,000 copies, something that was very rare back then and even rarer now today with today's book publishing. They knew, however, the book was going to be controversial, even among sympathetic historians who often perpetuate these patriarchal frameworks. One historian confronted them at a conference and said, "Why does Joseph Smith appear so marginal and negative in your narrative?" To which they responded, "This is Emma's biography, not Joseph's." And that caused the historian to be like, "Oh yeah, I can see how that is, the wheels turning of recognizing the shifting perspective." They also hoped that it would prompt church leaders who might not love the book to at least confront these important issues. Instead, as Linda wrote in a reminiscence, quote, "We confronted a pattern of secrecy, non-communication, and misrepresentation that was utterly distressing to us and to our families." Most importantly, in May 1985, several months after the book's publication, they discovered that the church had banned them from speaking in church settings. Bishops in Idaho, Utah, and Arizona received phone calls from authorities making sure it wasn't a written record, telling them not to invite Linda and Val to speak. They were very popular speakers in their different regions. Some bishops then took that message and announced to their wards that 2 girls, remember these are women over the age of 40, 2 girls had written a hit piece on Joseph Smith and that no one should support them by buying it. Linda, when hearing all these stories, confronted her bishop, who confirmed that he too received that phone call. She then started working with the stake president to determine the origins of that issue, and he discovered it was the Quorum of the 12 who sent out that instruction. They soon started receiving press requests asking, is this ban real? And they brought that to the stake president saying, hey, the LA Times is asking us about the ban. Can we talk to church leaders? And they were able to leverage that to hold a very important meeting with 2 junior apostles, Dallin H. Oaks and Neil A. Maxwell. They met several weeks after the ban was put in place. Linda and her husband, Jack, here's a photograph from them around this time, traveled to the church administration building and met with these 2 apostles. Maxwell and Oaks insisted that, well, we don't want people speaking in church settings because they could be selling their books, and that would be blurring the lines of ecclesiastical settings and commercial books, to which Linda said, I recognize that line and I'm careful. And she outlined several other rules she had to make sure she wasn't just hawking books in church settings. She always was introduced as a student of Emma's life, not a published author. She didn't bring up controversial matters. She knew how to read the room. And she stuck to a talk that the Church Correlation Committee itself had approved several years before when she spoke at a church setting. They also asked, well, do you have the same rule in place for, say, Richard Bushman, who had just published a biography of Joseph Smith's early life? And they admitted no, they hadn't. So eventually, after further conversation, Dallin H. Oaks confessed that the ban was due to their belief that the book subverted faith in the church and placed Joseph Smith in a negative light. And while they didn't come to any solutions in that meeting, it was kind of implied that, well, the problem will eventually go away. That was certainly not satisfied to Linda Newell. So here's how Linda recalled this meeting decades later in a reminiscence. Quote, I entered the meeting with Elder Oaks and Maxwell confident that reasonable people committed to the gospel and church could find a way to resolve the matter. I expected that the procedural irregularities would be rectified, even if the ban was not lifted right away. Instead, I heard an unmistakable message. To protect the church's authority and its official interpretation of Joseph Smith, Val and I were expendable. The leadership regretted both the unfairness and our pain, but accepted these conditions as necessary costs to achieve their purposes. As you might imagine, the meeting was not satisfactory to Linda Newell, so she and Val decided to work with the press in putting pressure on the church. She gave a statement to the LA Times, who ran a major story on this, and I think her statement is important enough to read at least an extended portion. Quote, I believe in the ability of members of my church to understand and benefit from history. It may raise questions, but questions are not bad. We grow by seeking answers and understanding. When we attempt to bury aspects of our own past, we only raise another set of disturbing questions and leave people prey to emerging historical information with no context in which to put it. The answers to many of the problems the church faces today lie in our historical roots. I have asked that the decision regarding my right to speak in LDS Church meetings be reconsidered by those who make it. I am hopeful that it will. Just note the tone of that response. This is someone who is committed to the LDS Church and is trying to find a workable solution. And in response to the story, she received lots and lots of notes and phone calls and letters from people within the LDS Church who supported her. Perhaps most tellingly, she received a phone call from the LDS author Maureen Whipple, who said, "My phone call to you represents the dozens of phone calls that have been to me expressing support for you," showing this broader network of people willing to support an honest approach to history. Eventually, this ban was overturned 9 months later, in April 1986, I guess 10 months later, after plenty of people spoke up against the church. Linda asked her stake president to once again ask the Quorum of the 12 if the ban was still in place, and the Quorum of the 12 responded that we've decided, good news, we've decided to remove the ban. But importantly, they never publicly announced the end of the ban. In fact, the Deseret News, the church's newspaper, had announced the start of the ban, and they never publicly announced the end. So there were still some assumptions for years afterward whether the ban was still in place. And importantly, church employees, including the historical division, were still not allowed to cite the book. It was on a blacklist. The lone exception was the wonderful book Women of Covenant, where one of the authors, Jill Durr, who was involved in the New Mormon History movement, was told, look, you need to remove your citations to Mormon Enigma. And she said to do so would be unethical because we relied on their scholarship. And I'm not moving forward with the book if you don't allow me to use the citations. And thankfully, they relented. So Linda, Jill Durr, and Maureen Ursenbach Beecher, and the other historians involved should be thanked for standing up for them. Overall, in the short term, the ban helped the book's sales. There were 40,000 copies of the hardback sold over the next few years. But it also meant that many of the Latter-day Saints who could have benefited from it had to stay away because of the negative stigma associated with the ban. Now let's touch on some of the lasting legacies. Both authors went on to have distinguished careers. Both of them served as president of the Mormon History Association. Linda Newell went on to author several important articles, including the influential article, A Gift Given, A Gift Taking, Washing, Anointing, and Blessing, The Sick Among Mormon Women, which was published in Sunstone. And Val Avery published a phenomenal biography of Joseph and Emma's last son, David Hiram Smith, titled From Mission to Madness, The Last Son of the Mormon Prophet. University of Illinois Press eventually bought the copyright to the book and issued a second edition in paperback in 1994, which allowed them to update the story as well as remove citations to the Hoffman forgeries, especially the 1844 Joe Smith III alleged blessing. That paperback copy has since sold 25,000 copies, about 1,000 per year, at least as a few years ago, which I should emphasize is unheard of in the historical world, or at least the academic historical world. And most importantly, the book inspired generations of historians, especially women, who wanted to engage the past in a way that highlighted the role of the experience and experience of women, as well as challenge traditional patriarchal frameworks and structures, which is why this book and its authors are so significant to the modern Mormon historical community. I hope you found this video useful. If you want to learn more about the background to this book, thankfully Linda Newell wrote a very thoughtful reminiscence that was published in the volume edited by Joseph Geisner, Writing Mormon History. Her chapter is titled Living the Journey, Reaping the Whirlwind, Reflections on Writing Emma Hale Smith's Biography. It's from that reminiscence that I get a lot of the details from this presentation. I want to close with a couple personal experiences though. When I was hired by the LDS Church Historic Sites while I was an undergrad student during a summer away from my BYU education, I was working on their team that was trying to restore the Harmony, Pennsylvania home. That's Joseph and Emma's first home, where they translate a lot of the Book of Mormon and lived between 1827 and 1830. And the first book I was assigned to read to understand that era was Mormon Enigma, which showed how far the church has come. So I'm ever grateful for my bosses, wonderful historians in their own right, who made me confront that history of Mormon Enigma. And much of my historical career since then came as a result of that. A few years later, I was very fortunate to meet Linda Newell at a movie gathering, a documentary on Joseph Smith, and I told her this story, and she said she was so glad to hear that, especially given that just a couple decades earlier, church employees weren't allowed to even cite the book, let alone read it. She also thanked me for my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, which she really appreciated, took Emma's story seriously. In fact, I'll close with this. One of the best compliments I received about my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, that's the book over there, which is a story of the rise and fall of Nauvoo, came in a criticism, a negative review of the book that was published in an apologetic journal, The Interpreter, in which the historian critiqued me for making Emma the heroine of the story and saying, quote, "Not since Mormon Enigma have we seen a work more inclusive and supportive of the First Lady of Mormonism." Now, within the context of that review, this was negative, that I was placing Joseph Smith in a negative light and taking Emma's story too seriously. But to me, I can't imagine a higher compliment than that one, because I truly believe Linda Newell and Val Avery are titans in the field of Mormon history, both the academic and the cultural world. It's on their shoulders that we now stand. And their work is a great reminder of why history remains to be relevant, that wrestling with the past tells us a lot about ourselves and the community, and it's always connected to the world we now live in, not just the world that we're studying. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, hit the like button if you did, share it with others. I hope you've enjoyed this series on the Mormon history battles of the 1970s and 1980s. Please join me in the live discussion on Wednesday, April 1st at 7 p.m. Mountain Time as we discuss the many lessons. History, I think, as seen in this series, is quite competitive, it's contested, but it's oh so important because it's at the core of what makes a community.